Okay, so hello everyone. Today I'm joined by author Tiffany Jenkins, who's the author of Strangers and Intimates, which I have here. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for joining us.
A pleasure.
I'd love to know a bit about your background and how you got interested in the topic of private life.
Well, I'm an academic and a writer, and I was always interested, and in fact, I always thought a private life was important. And I was struck by the way in which if you didn't emote in public or didn't bring your kind of private life out in public, you were seen as a bit weird and old-fashioned. And I didn't really like that. And then you see across kind of culture examples of it really burdening people. The person I'm thinking of is Kate Middleton, who, when she received a cancer diagnosis, tried to keep it private. And now she's a public figure, so I can understand people felt like she had to be out in public. But it struck me as a very difficult process for her, dealing with something that's quite momentous, that you want to sort of deal with your intimates, but kind of being compelled really to go out there and talk about it and put her kind of diagnosis on display before she was ready.
Yeah. And how have attitudes changed between seeing privacy as something that's dangerous versus something that's precious and worth protecting?
Well, when I started this book, I thought I was going to begin in like the Victorian period, where you had a society both in Britain and America who really valued privacy and private life. You shut the door, you close the curtain, and people respected that border. Um, and then I thought, well, I really need to find out, where does it come from? Is it a natural thing? Have we always wanted privacy? You sort of assume that people have always wanted it, but absolutely not. It's not the case at all. You go back to the 17th century and before, and there was no distinction really between public life and private life. And people talked about privacy as something dangerous. Um, Something only for adulterers and murderers, according to one preacher. Or to another, he said that there was a sort of instruction manual that says something really important, I thought, which is do nothing in private that you wouldn't do publicly. And I think people actually feared privacy. It was something that if they were on their own, if they were in private, then the devil might come and tempt them with all sorts of sort of dodgy temptations. That did change. It went from being a sort of something threatening, something risky, something dangerous in the 17th century to the Victorian period when it was seen as, well, it was a national value. Privacy was something to be esteemed. It was sacred. There's all sorts of privacy panics in the 19th century, whether it's around the royals, Victoria and Albert, or I write about an Italian nationalist called Giuseppe Mazzini who comes to Britain as a political exile, and the government opens his letters because he's a revolutionary. And this is a national scandal. His private letters are seen as sacred, almost like yeah, almost like a kind of almost like a church that they're invading. I think now, however, it's sort of flipped over again. So I was really struck during the Leveson trial, which is a phone hacking trial, and there was a tabloid journalist called Paul McMullen who said about privacy, because he was invading the privacy of many people. He said it's, ultimately it's a space for bad people to do bad things in. It's for pedos. Ultimately, nobody needs it. So that sense of privacy being dangerous is coming back.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned the devil then. I mean, I guess religion is a key factor here, and even that people didn't necessarily feel they had privacy because they were being observed all the time anyway.
Yes, I mean, the God saw you, whether you were on your own or not. He saw everything and forgot nothing. And it was a deeply religious society, sort of the 17th, 16th, and earlier centuries, where there was, I mean, authority, whether it was in the shape of the Pope or the king or religious leaders, really owned all your life. Whether you were out amongst, whether you were shopping in the marketplace or you were at home, you were being watched by these people, and there was no sense that there should be a private space for them. But curiously, it was in the wake of the Protestant Reformation and then the religious wars that followed it that you begin to have this almost accidental creation of a private life. I don't think anybody set out to do this, but there was a kind of twofold process. One with the Protestant Reformation, which kind of um, pushed away the church, the Catholic Church and the Pope and intermediaries, and said, an individual should consult scripture on his own, really, and have this kind of private dialogue with God. I think that, coupled with the kind of the printing press and the translation of many of these texts into German or English from the Latin, kind of cultivated an interiority in the individual. Now, it should be said that Protestants were not in any way pro-private life. If anything, you think of like the Catholic confessional. That was actually quite a slightly more private space, and Protestants really kind of intervened into intimate relations. They encouraged spying on your neighbours, even through peepholes. It was an entirely legitimate and endorsed practice. But I think one thing that happened in England, which is that you had this kind of flip-flopping between religions. So with the Protestant Reformation kind of in England, propelled by Henry VIII, that then moved towards more Protestantism and then back to Catholicism and then Protestantism. So you had the kind of the leader of the day, which demanded your obedience and submission, but changed quite dramatically, at a time when people were highly religious. So their internal lives were kind of constantly in flux in terms of what was demanded of them. And I think what happened is that people started thinking differently in private about how they might follow God, how they might, how they might achieve salvation to the authority of the day, thus creating this sort of division. And that resulted in this concept called toleration, which is after, English Civil War, where, thousands and thousands of people died. Europe was blood-soaked as a result of the kind of wars over religion. This concept of toleration evolved, which was basically to deal with religious diversity, to deal with the fact that people believe and follow faith differently. We will create a space in private for them to do so. It wasn't seen as the private sphere at that time wasn't seen as a positive thing. It was almost seen as a space where we could just deal with differences of opinion by putting them in there.
Yeah, and I guess the translation from the Latin into more easily understood text, coupled with kind of rising literacy rates. There's something in your book that's really interesting around like increased personal power and the kind of increase in privacy.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, if the reading, people, it kind of freed them, reading in their own everyday language, not being talked to by priests in Latin, but reading for yourself begins to free your mind, doesn't it? And there's a really nice quote by the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who has that very famous phrase that life is brutal and short. But he talks about how in the mind, thought is free. You can think what you want to think. You can think something that nobody else knows you're thinking. And I think that is a kind of beginning of trusting yourself, trusting what you believe and what you've kind of thought through. And it's that tussle between the individual thinking, this is the way I want to, first follow religion, and later in the 18th century, conduct my intimate relations. That kind of idea of what people start talking about as individual conscience and freedom of conscience, which comes kind of by that kind of freeing of the individual. That is the basis for private life.
I mean, it's probably obvious that the public realm was mostly male for a very long time. I mean, how did the concept of privacy affect women specifically over time?
It's uneven. So I think in the 18th century, when you did have this split between public and private, and the beginnings of the idea that the private sphere is a really valuable space, that liberates people, both male and female, I think. So you have the split of the household from the marketplace. So, people are no longer sort of buying and selling within the home and producing what they live off of, but can go and buy it in the marketplace and retreat to the home. It becomes a space of sort of intimacy and romance and freedom. At the same time, it is often women, it is always women who are confined to it. So although there's a kind of liberatory moment from feudalism in the 18th century, you do get the beginnings of this kind of confinement. And so there's a book, a really brilliant little novella called The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Gilmore Perkins, a 19th century American author who is pretty much based on her own personal experience. So once she's married, she has a baby and just basically succumbs to depression. She goes to see a doctor who advises her what he to take what he calls the rest cure. And that is basically to lie around all day, eat only dairy products, have no friends, no stimulation, no books, no pen. She's not to touch anything. She's not to read anything. Um, and she's to have her children with her all the time. Anyway, she goes, it doesn't work. And in The Yellow Wallpaper, she describes this life, which is, the life of privacy for women is often one of restriction. You're not educated. You don't have access to all the kind of the stimulation of the public world, the education. You can't be a lawyer. You can't be a doctor like men. And actually, the respect for privacy in the Victorian period was so profound that you could be beaten in your home, and it would be against the law. But if you were married and it was your husband beating you, it was basically fine because they respected the kind of sanctity of the private realm so kind of profoundly. So it's more complicated for women than men. But equally, to kind of push back on it a little, Virginia Woolf also writes about how women, what they actually needed was autonomy within the private realm, and that's what they didn't have when they were kind of constantly, washing and cooking and serving the man. Um, she argues that you needed to kind of be an autonomous subject within the home. And then later, of course, you've got people like earlier, you've got people like Mary Wollstonecraft, and later feminists like Betty Friedan, who basically say women need access to the public realm as well as being autonomous subjects within the private.
Thank you. And kind of coming forward to today, where the boundaries between private and public seem more blurred, what do you think the key drivers are behind this?
Well, it's often said that it's technology, particularly social media, Facebook, and all the rest of it, that is the driver of everybody putting their private lives out in public. I don't think technology is unimportant, but I don't think it's the key driver. I sort of look at a number of developments in the 1970s that I illustrate actually with early reality TV programs. A family called the Wilkins in Britain and the Louds in America, and they put their lives on display. They invite the documentary makers in, and inevitably it all goes terribly wrong because anybody who invites their, documentary makers into your own family will have all the kind of messy, uncontrollable parts revealed. We're all behind closed doors, odd and peculiar, and that sometimes doesn't stand up to kind of public scrutiny. But this happens earlier than Mark Zuckerberg, I think probably before he's even born. And you have to ask why. And I think if you listen to what those protagonists say, Margaret Wilson talks about the need to be authentic, and that somehow the kind of private life is more important and less phony than public. And I think there's an element there where ideas about how we should be, almost like what a human being is, have changed. And there's a kind of almost demoting of the public side of us, our profession or our political affiliations or what we do when we put on our makeup and put on a suit and go out in the world. There's a kind of degrading of that. There's also, I argue, a big turning the private realm inside out with this kind of the feminist mantra from the radical feminists that the personal is political. And you can see that this is true to an extent. So they're talking about a lot of our private problems as women, access to abortion, for example, are actually public issues. And we need to, if we want equal rights, we need to go into the home. But I think they took it too far, really, and started focusing on child rearing and language and minute personal details. So they politicized the private realm, which also opened it out. I think those two things, the kind of the authenticity that we can hear today in things like bring your true self to work. Why? Don't do it. Be professional. Keep your true self at home. And also this kind of the way in which our politics has become so personalized, and we've become obsessed with the kind of private lives of public figures rather than their public achievements. I think those things are really important drivers. And then you do have tech that comes along and kind of just speeds it all up.
Yeah, which I guess, I mean, in your book, you kind of start with the camera, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Cameras, wiretapping, and then here we are, social media.
Yeah.
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 I mean, and another thing that's more common in the modern world, which I find interesting, obviously, well, I am a therapist, so this is why I find it interesting, but it's more common for people to have therapists. And your book got me thinking about the kind of unusual nature of the therapist-client relationship, where a therapist is kind of temporarily adopted into the intimate circle of the clients, and yet it remains a professional relationship. So, I mean, that's, and part of what's difficult about therapy is that you risk, you're courting the risk of feeling very exposed. So you're kind of in this bubble where it's private and public. And it works because of the non-judgmental stance of the therapist, because of the assurance of confidentiality, and also because the therapist's life is largely concealed. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that and whether a kind of an implied confidentiality is what you see as the cornerstone of kind of intimate relationships.
It's a really interesting question. There's quite a lot to unpack in it. Um, so yes, people start going to therapy early on in the 20th century, don't they? And I think that suggests something has changed in what human beings are. I mean, I don't think the self is this kind of static thing. It changes what we need and what we're capable of, and um, what we are, I think, changes. And I think you do begin to see the introduction of a kind of a more emotional self. I think you're absolutely right that it absolutely has to be confidential.
Mm.
And where, I mean, people will tell you things, and I know this because I've been to therapy. Um, you will only, you can only really be honest and vulnerable in that private space. If you think it's going to be public, I mean, today lots of people record conversations, and you get, these leaks in about it, whether it's Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, even, we've got a very leaky culture. But as soon as you think that you might be betrayed, you cannot be honest. So I think privacy, whether it's in intimate relations or in a kind of religious or therapeutic context, has to be respected. Um, it is interesting. You do have to wonder, why people can't tell their intimates these things, and probably sometimes it's to do with them, isn't it? So they need this sort of extra third space. And I've always found something interesting, which is that when you reveal confidences to a professional, it does create a sort of peculiarly intimate relationship. And I'm sure there's a degree to which, is it called transference? Where, by disclosing your secrets, you do kind of bond, but it's only a one-way thing, I imagine.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And I mean, I wonder whether it's partly what you're exploring is things that might even be private to yourself.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a companion to help you unearth that.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. You know something's not quite right. Um, and you think it, I mean, I went going to therapist once, this is a revelation, not a massive revelation, but you think you're going for something.
Mhm.
You think you're going, and you think that this is probably what it is, and you need to talk it through. But after a while, you realize, and it's helpful to have an outsider who's on your side, i.e., not somebody who's involved, but an outsider who's on your side, sort of work through it with you. And yes, there are so many parts of ourselves that we don't know. We don't know, it's sort of the bubbling away.
Thank you. I realized that was a kind of, slight curveball.
Curveballs are
Um,
good.
um, yeah, so as we're kind of getting to that we're in a world now where public disclosure is much more common. And what are the impacts of a public sphere that's more and more filled with previously private information?
I think there's twofold. There's the impact on the individual. So related to your last question, why do we need privacy? It is so we can work through our own issues. If we didn't have it, we would have no personal autonomy. But you need that sort of place to for emotional release, for self-reflection, and for kind of develop intimate relationships. And I do think that makes us a better person in the public sphere. So, like after even just something simple like after a weekend, you go back to work on Monday morning and you just feel more grounded, I suppose. Hannah Arendt once put it something along the lines of, a person without a private life becomes shallow. You need that sort of the grounding um, to be a better public person. And I think there's something also about the public sphere, is that when it is just kind of invaded with intimacy, um, we stop thinking about ourselves as kind of political people and as professional people. And I think it kind of becomes a bit degraded. Um, there's a place for being different there's a place for being kind of public selves as well as private selves. And I think as much as a kind of defending a private sphere, we also need to kind of defend what some would call the phoniness and hypocrisy of public life. Because it does, to go back to the 17th century and toleration, it does sort of allow people to have different ideas and feelings, but get along. It does allow kind of us to both judge and assess people on their public achievements. I think at the moment we're kind of obsessed with the worst aspects of people's private lives rather than what humanity is kind of capable of. So I think it degrades both kind of public life I think it degrades public life to be so obsessed with the private.
Interesting. And social media is a really fascinating sphere for this, where supposedly you're seeing more of people sharing their private lives, but really it's a private life that they've deemed fit for public consumption for whatever reason, some sort of reinforcement or validation, or seeking communities that have otherwise maybe been eroded in kind of general life. Um, and I'm just curious about that really, and what is that part of why social media can have such a kind of terrible effect on individual mental health?
I think I think a couple of things. I mean, the mental health thing is obviously a real problem. I don't think it's just social media. Um, I think you sort of have a kind of a crisis of community and meaning, particularly for young people, and they're very pessimistic about their future. I think that's a kind of wider cultural problem. But they certainly spend too much time online. And if you look at the differences between girls and boys, it's also quite instructive. So girls seem to spend more time, I mean, boys will spend more time online playing games where they shoot each other. And strangely, that's more healthy than what girls do, which is often the kind of, yeah, the posing in your bedroom or your kind of the obsession with how you look. And then they drive each other bonkers by kind of uh, putting up what parties they're at and you're not at it. I mean, if I could think of what it was like when I was I mean, just no, I do not want that. So they certainly spend too much time online. But I think online life doesn't have to be the way it is. And I think had it been introduced at a different time in history, social media would look very different. So I do think, it could be put to much more constructive uses, and it is indeed put to much more constructive uses. Discussions, this might seem a bit overly earnest, but book groups about, which there are obviously, but, much more kind of less self-focused, less narcissistic focused. And I think you do have this problem where, young people feel as if unless they have the likes online, particularly young girls, then they don't almost exist. But what they need to be able to do is sort of go out into the world and exist in a kind of in a public world. As for the kind of yeah, you're putting your private life online the whole time. I mean, you can see that with Meghan and Harry. I know, but they are like, they are the worst case of what a lot of people do, which is that Harry will never reconcile with his family if he's always disclosing everything that they've said to him behind closed doors. So he needs to button up a little bit. And equally, Meghan putting her private life online all the time, you don't trust it. It doesn't seem authentic because it seems done for the cameras. And actually, it would be better if she had sort of some public achievements to talk about online, whatever charity she's working for and that sort of thing, rather than, how she bakes cakes and things like that. So I sort of think if we valued public life more and also respected our private life, then actually social media could change as much. I mean, I don't think social media causes the particular form that it takes. It's a more a reflection um, than a driver.
Yeah, I can kind of agree with that. And it also feels a little bit like once a horse is bolted, and obviously it's the whole money-making system of its own.
Yeah, it's not easy. I mean, it it's accelerated and people are very comfortable. I mean, but people are very, very comfortable culturally just being out there in the open. You look at the way in which, I mean, you look at porn, for example,
Mm.
online. Utterly, utterly odd, I think, to do that. But people feel quite relaxed about it. And I think, this is not adult content stars, but normal, normal people, everyday people. And I spoke to some in the for the book, and they just talked about, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, why hide it?
Mm.
And actually, that's the curious kind of, that's almost like as destructive as an idea to private life as any technology. Because I think we have to sort of defend a space where, yes, it is, the private world is a space where you behave a little bit badly. Everybody needs that because we all need to kind of be off for a while. But also, keeping things private doesn't mean that they are shameful or wrong or bad. And just because something's good doesn't mean you have to kind of expose it. And I think we need to think about things like love and giving birth or um, even dying. These are quite private things in as much as they don't really respond well to scrutiny of others, the scrutiny of strangers, and so it doesn't mean that they're valueless, that we don't expose them, but it's almost like they're weighty and unruly and at times the kind of irrational parts of ourselves, and they need space to breathe. I think we need to be sort of talking about the importance of that and that's why we need a kind of private life.
Thank you. Last one for me. The title of your book, I really enjoy, Strangers and Intimates. And I guess it seemed that part of what you're kind of exploring is the fact that if you, in a world where, that they come together. So in the world, and one defines the other, similar to your argument about public and private. So if you treat strangers as intimates, then you risk the opposite being true, that intimates become strangers. And Yeah, just so why do we fundamentally need a private life as you see it?
No, it's that's a really good way of putting it. I was really struck when I wrote the book about the way in which, like in the 18th and 19th century, you did get this sense of separations, and people talked about how to deal with strangers. So you had the invention of the handshake, and people talked about politeness and civility, but also a kind of evaluation of intimacy and what you would be like with a kind of with your close loved ones. And I do think that sort of separation has now dissolved, and we treat strangers like intimates. So, I mean, it's a silly example, but social kissing has replaced the handshake, and there's a lot of intimacy in public life, but also there's this kind of the opening up of the private does end up treating each other like strangers. Whether it's there's all sorts of ways in which we've opened up, whether it's surveillance or the politicization or social media into our private life, means that it's no longer secluded. And we need to be able to draw the curtain, not least for our own self-development, emotional release, but also so we can go out and be better strangers with people we don't know.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Such a pleasure to speak to you. Thank
Thank
you
you
for
very
your
much.
time.